Welcome to the 2019 Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Nick Barley, I'm director of the festival. What an honour it is to be director of this great festival that's made so great by its audiences and so great also by its authors. It's a big festival, as you know, and it's the festival that's not just the vision of one artistic director, but of many, many people who've put together the programme this year. And this year in particular, in a year in which we need new stories, in which we need new perspectives on the world, I'm very, very honoured that DeRay Mckesson has agreed to be one of our guest selectors. DeRay's story, in case you're not familiar with it, is that he gave up his job as a teacher in order to protest against the actions after the death of a young man in Ferguson in the USA. And he spent something like 400 days protesting to try to improve the rights of people of colour, of black people, and African Americans in the USA. And his work was instrumental in the launch of Black Lives Matter. And it seemed appropriate to me that we should ask DeRay not just to talk about his own life and work, but also to select some other writers whose work we need to hear in this time when we need new stories. We also want to hear your views, and audiences inspire authors just as much as authors inspire audiences. And so I really hope that you will help me to inspire today's authors by giving them a huge welcome to the 2019 Edinburgh International Book Festival. Please welcome DeRay Mckesson and Ibram Kendi.
Good morning, everybody. We're excited to be here. And Ibram, thanks for being able to do the festival.
Of course, yeah. Thank you for being a selector. I mean, it's an honor.
So yesterday, August 9th, was actually the 5-year anniversary of the protests in St. Louis. We were in the street for 400 days. It was a long 400 days. One of the reasons why I invited Ibram to be here for this conversation is that I've learned so much from his work around anti-racism, his work around pushing us to think deeper about how do we build an anti-racist society. And I'll start with one of the things that we say as organizers is this idea that people talk about truth and reconciliation a lot, but we would say the truth has to come before the reconciliation. And Ibram, I feel like so much of your work is about sort of pushing us to think about the truth first. I think about his book won the National Book Award, Stamped from the Beginning. His first book, this book actually isn't even out yet. It's just out here at the festival first, which is exciting. But how did you get into this work as a historian?
I think, kind of like you, I saw a glaring and a serious problem, and more specifically, the way in which Americans and even people across the world understood the history of racism. And even more specifically, I realized that the history of racist ideas, which was my last what my last book was on, primarily left out a very sort of glaring and popular kind of racist ideas. And I'm specifically talking about assimilationist ideas. I'm specifically talking about these notions that certain racial groups are culturally or even behaviorally inferior. And that's why racial disparities and inequities still exist. There is something people think that is wrong with people of color. And whether that comes out of their culture, whether that comes out of even poverty, whether that comes out of oppression. And those ideas aren't even considered racist ideas. People who believe them think that they're, or consider themselves to be not racist. And so you're absolutely right. I wanted to sort of set the record straight and start telling the truth about what people really think.
Now, this book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and a lot of people are like, what is an anti-racist? Back at home, we have some trouble with our president, if you haven't heard. It's hard times at home. And Ibram is somebody who's really helped the country think about this idea of what does it mean to be racist? Because at home, there are a lot of people who are like, they do something really bad, and then they're like, I'm not racist. Can you talk about where that impulse comes from, and then what does it actually mean to not be racist? Which is what you talk about in the beginning here, so this is sort of a spoiler for the introduction. But what does it mean to be anti-racist?
Well, I think the impulse comes from how people define a racist. So people imagine that a racist is first and foremost a bad person, an evil person. They think of a racist as a fixed identity. They think of a racist as a tattoo. They think that a racist is in one's bones. So the president said, I don't have a racist bone in my body. But even Democratic candidate for president in Joe Biden said, I don't have a bone in my body. So really across the ideological board, people think that it is essential to a person being racist. And so of course, if you think that way, no matter what you say or do, your response is going to be, no, I'm not that. I'm not racist. But I would say that we shouldn't be defining a racist in that way. It's not a fixed category. It's not a slur. It's a descriptive term. It describes what we're saying or doing in the moment, and we change. And so when someone is saying something like African nations are shitholes, when someone is saying that Baltimore is infested, when someone is saying that Latinx immigrants are invading this country, they're saying racist ideas, and they're being racist. When someone is supporting policies that ban people, or that round up 600 people in Mississippi, Latinx people, causing their children to have nowhere to go, they're executing a racist policy. They're being racist. But then on the flip side, when they're charged with being racist, whether they're Donald Trump, whether they're a white nationalist, whether they're a Jim Crow segregationist, whether they're a colonizer, whether they are a slaveholder or slave trader, what is their response? No, I'm not racist. And so in many ways, the term not racist has always been a term of denial. It has always been a term of, I am not guilty, no matter what the person has actually done. And it really has no meaning other than as a term of denial. And so when a term has no meaning, we should probably stop using that term. But anti-racist actually does have meaning. And so if a racist believes that certain racial groups are better or worse than others, an anti-racist thinks that there's nothing wrong or even right with any racial group, that the racial groups are equals. If a racist is supporting policies that create racial inequities and racial injustices, then an anti-racist is supporting policies that create racial equity, that create racial justice.
Yes, that's right. That is really right. And the examples that he gave are real examples at home. I don't know if you heard about Mississippi. Trump just arrested 600 people on the first day of school. Schools weren't notified. There were a lot of people that got arrested. The kids were left at school. It was a real nightmare home. What is the relationship between racist ideas and racist policies? This is sort of a teaser for the last book before we get into this book.
Sure. So we have been taught, and when I say we, I'm talking about really people across the world, have been taught that what caused people to institute racist policies, whether that's, enslaving and slave trading tens of millions of people in Africa, whether colonizing entire continents, whether performing genocide and executing genocide on tens of millions of people, that what caused people to go about executing these racist policies was because of their racist ideas. That people enslaved people because they thought they should be enslaved, because they thought they were the cursed descendants of Ham, or they thought they were somehow civilizing them after being apparently running around and knocking into trees for thousands of years in Africa, since apparently that's all we were doing. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that we've been led to believe that racist ideas lead to racist policies. We've also been led to believe that people who've produced racist ideas do so because of their ignorance or because of their hate. Back home, whenever Trump says something that's racist, the common response is, oh, he's so ignorant. He just must not know about Baltimore. He must not know about Nigeria. He just must not know about these places and people. And that's why he's saying that Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate general, was an honorable person. He just must not know about history. Or he just must hate people of color. So we believe that it's ignorance and hate that causes people to produce racist ideas, and people's racist ideas lead them to supporting and instituting racist policies. But I actually argue and stand from the beginning, and I continue to argue in How to Be an Anti-Racist, that it's actually quite the opposite. That people, out of self-interest, institute racist policies. I'm going to slave trade, enslave, segregate, mass incarcerate people out of political or even economic or even cultural self-interest. That is going to then lead to all sorts of racial inequities. The only two explanations for any sort of racial inequity is either it's the result of bad policy or bad people. I'm going to tell people it's not my bad policies, it's the result of those inferior people. So black people are twice as likely to be unemployed in the United States, not because of racist policies within our economic system, but because black workers are lazy, black workers are unqualified. So then people consume those ideas, and then they don't do what? They don't resist those racist policies. And then those who benefit from those racist policies are allowed to continue to benefit. All the while, the people are going after the victims of those racist policies, right, as opposed to the true source of this race problem. And so actually, racist policies are leading to racist ideas, not the other way around.
It is interesting. I spend most of my time on issues of policing, and we run into this problem all the time. People think that it's like a bad police officer, or that we need to get a better prosecutor or a better mayor, and we're like, we actually want a system that works whether the people are good or bad, right? And you think about at home, a third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer, which is sort of wild. And this is actually the first year ever where black people are more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence, which we never thought we'd see. I think about the setting, being in such an old country, a country much older than our very baby country in so many ways. Does racism manifest differently based on sort of where it is in the world? Did you find, is there nuance in the way that racism manifests?
So I would say that, first and foremost, that it seems as if every nation on earth presents itself as not as racist as the United States. Right. Just like, 50 years ago, everybody would position themselves against what? South Africa, right? So in a way, the United States, particularly Trump's United States, has become this sort of paragon of racism. So we're not racist like them, or we're not racist at all, okay, right? And so for me, I determine the existence of racism in a country, not by what its politicians are saying, not by what its people are saying, not by how many people are saying they're not racist, but by whether there are racial disparities and inequities. And one of the things that some countries have done is they have refused to categorize in certain ways statistically by race, and then because they don't have the data to demonstrate racial inequities, they suggest that, we're post-racial, or this nation is not racist, or we don't need to categorize by race because what? We are, quote, not racist. But you can't assess whether a nation is racist if you're not categorizing by race, because if you're not categorizing by race, you can't see racial disparities. And if you can't see racial disparities, you can't see racist policies. And if you can't see racist policies, you can't see the politicians and other people in power who are putting those policies in place. So I actually do think that those basic concepts, like racial inequities, like racist ideas, like racist policies, like racist power, sort of operates in each nation, but obviously the people in power, the policies, the ideas are different based on the nature, of the country.
Now, in the book, you start with this anecdote about being a preacher's kid. Before I ask you about the way you constructed the book, which is fascinating to me, how is being raised in the church in that way, how has that informed the way that you think about your work?
I think probably the closest and most obvious way it informs my work is I talk about, as you know, like denial almost being like the heartbeat of racism. So we talked earlier about all of those people many of us would consider to be racist, self-identify as not racist. They're obviously in denial. And really, I have yet to come across a person who we would diagnose as racist who's willing to say they're racist too. And so that's just essential to the way this sort of operates and functions. And so I would say, actually, that the contrast to racism, to the sort of heartbeat of racism is denial, is that the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. And so growing up in the church, obviously, growing up particularly in the Christian church, both of my parents were ministers, and obviously one of the critical sort of aspects of being a Christian, particularly, we weren't Catholic, but obviously even more so with Catholicism, is confessing one's sins, right? Because you can't necessarily become saved, right, until you confess your sins. Become saved from what? Right? The evils of the world, the evils of the devil. You have to be willing to acknowledge and admit what you have done. And then typically Christians would say, yes, the reason why I have done these evil things is because I'm living in an evil world. In the same way an anti-racist would say, the reason why I've expressed these racist ideas is because I'm living in a racist world where it's our common sense to look at difference and think it's better or worse than our own. And so I would probably say that that's probably the most obvious sort of encouraging people to confess their anti-racist ideas and racist ideas. And in many ways, this book was a confessional.
I like it. You know, one of the things that we say in organizing is this idea that white supremacy is a smog and we all inhale it whether we want to or not. We all participate in the inhaling. What we can do is make sure that when we inhale it, that we see it and that we don't exhale it. That part of our work is to name it as it comes in, but not replicate it as it goes out. Why did you organize the book like you did? So you don't have your books yet, but the chapters are like they're all one word: power, biology, ethnicity, body, culture, behavior, failure, success, gender. Why is this organized in this way?
So I take a deep breath because it was really difficult, writing this book. Because ultimately what I wanted to do, and this really speaks to this question, was I not only wanted to sort of have this sort of personal narrative of my own sort of journey, to striving to be anti-racist, really confessing many of the more horrific things I've thought and said and done towards particularly Black people. But I also wanted to sort of show the type of journey that each of us can take, conceptual journey, to be anti-racist. In other words, I wanted to sort of show how certain concepts build on each other. So for instance, I think one of the early chapters is biology. So I sort of talk about the way in which an anti-racist and a racist would think about biology. And so obviously an anti-racist would say, as science has shown, that from a genetic standpoint, there's really no such thing as racial distinction or racial difference. But if we want to talk about racial distinctions or genetic distinctions, geneticists have actually found that West Africans are more genetically similar to people who live around here than people in East Africa. But of course, the way in which we connect genes to race so deliberately, that seems preposterous to people, right? But that's actually scientifically the case. So once you recognize that we're pretty much the same, we're created equal, we're genetically the same, 99% the same, then the next step is saying, okay, we actually do have ethnic ancestry. That is actually different. So that's why the next chapter is on ethnic racism. So how do you understand ethnic, genetic, and ancestral difference while being an anti-racist? And then each ethnic group tends to have a different culture, right? So then how do you understand cultural difference as an anti-racist? And then each cultural and ethnic body exists, right? And so obviously the Black body exists in the United States, and the way in which people look at bodies in the United States, and I would probably say here too, our bodies are looked upon as dangerous, right, fundamentally. And how does that sort of operate? And how does an anti-racist sort of operate? And then from there, behavior, class, color. And so what I'm ultimately sort of building on is how we're thinking and how we should be acting as an anti-racist from these different standpoints. And then ultimately, when I get to gender and sexuality, what becomes critical, I think, in those chapters is that it's impossible to be anti-racist if we don't have an intersectional perspective.
Boom. It almost was like a setup because I have a question about the biology chapter. First is sort of just an explanation is that in this chapter you talk about sort of being over the phrase microaggression, sort of like past that, because you root that in a period of post-racial politics, it seems. And if you remember President Obama, which we fondly remember because, Lord, we are struggling at home, one of the things that happened when Obama got elected is that people were like, we have transcended racism. That racism was a thing of the past. Got a black guy in the White House. Everything must be better. Didn't turn out to be true. And would love to know why you are. I didn't think. I remember reading this part and being like, okay, Ibram is over microaggression. Why over that term? Can you define the term for people that don't know the term, and then sort of why do you root that in a post-racial moment and you're past it?
Sure. So microaggressions is really a term that primarily scholars use, but more and more regular everyday people are using it to sort of understand, particularly when subjective or let's say people of color, on their everyday experience, they are experiencing forms of racism. So whether that's a person, you're moving into your apartment and a person thinks that you must be robbing that apartment, whether you have locks and a person wants to touch your hair, whether a person clutches their purse as they're walking by you. There are these sort of things that happen hour after hour, regularly each day, that really showcases another person's, in a sense, those who conceived of that term distinguish it from a racist policy. These are sort of things that is happening to you based on what other individuals are doing to you sort of constantly on a daily basis. The reason why I am a little over that term is because, so it was actually coined in 1971, I believe, but it didn't really become a popular term within scholarly discourse, let alone everyday people, until the Obama era. And it was in this era of, as DeRay stated, this post-racial era, that both liberals and conservatives were imagining that on some level, if not totally, the nation was post-racial. So we need to stop talking about and condemning racism. But racism persisted. So then in a political moment where it is in a way becoming almost politically incorrect to use the R word, racism, what some scholars decided to do and what became popular was essentially creating or popularizing other terms that talked about racism without talking about racism. And one of those terms was microaggressions, right? And so it became extremely popular during that period. And another reason why I actually felt that the term racist abuse was more exacting is because, from those examples that I described, it's in a way, as a body or as a person who is regularly subjected to those types of things, it's equivalent to, if any of us are in an abusive relationship and we're constantly being subjected to physical or even verbal abuse, we call that abuse because it literally impacts our emotions, it impacts how we go about each day. It literally has an emotional impact. And I don't think microaggressions is exacting enough to really speak through the toll that it takes, nor do I think it is the type of term that everyday people can really understand its meaning.
Yeah, my aunt is like, micro what? But she is like racist. She's like, I get that. That makes sense to me. It was in that chapter that I was thinking about, as somebody who has also written a book, there are a lot of things that don't make the book, right? Like you do all this stuff and then that one chapter doesn't make it, or the paragraph gets cut, or the story gets cut. So I'd be interested to know, what are some things that didn't make the book?
So actually,
It's real though. Wait till y'all write a book. It is.
Yeah.
You like died over this one chapter, and nobody will ever see it.
so actually, one of the things I was thinking about, the way in which I was initially thinking about ending the book, was having this fictional sort of chapter that would, in a way, be a look into an anti-racist society in all of its imperfections. And I thought, because a lot of this, of course, in a way, being anti-racist in a racist society, in a racist world, is in a way dreaming, right? Is imagining, is being so completely different to other people around you. And in a way, you have to sort of have hope and imagination, which is, why your book was so essential. And I think it would be a great book to be in conversation with my book. And I thought that would really sort of open up the mind. And also it would open us up to see the way in which, in a truly anti-racist society, it would not just be better for people of color, it would be better for almost everyone. And I think, because I think one of the myths, one of the greatest myths of the racist project, and one of the ways that I think it's particularly been able to control white working class and even middle class people. And we've begun to talk about this as it relates to white poor people, but not necessarily white middle income people. There's this belief that a racist society is better for them than, let's say, an anti-racist society. And it is without question that white middle income people benefit from racism more than people of color. But the question is, if we had a truly egalitarian society, would they benefit more than the society that currently exists? So in the United States, for instance, white middle income people are very happy with their highly resourced public schools and compare them constantly to the lower resourced schools of people of color. And so they're like, man, if we had an equal society, then our schools would be like those schools. As opposed to, my schools would be like the prep schools in New England for the super rich. You see the way that you can completely sort of shift. And so I wanted really for people to see that. And then also, as you know, you have people of color who, in many ways, who imagine also that a different type of anti-racist society in which they would lose. In which they recognize the ways in which, in certain types of ways, they gain when they're the only one, right? And I would want to show them that too, although some of them would still resist it.
And that chapter 2 also made me think about, I'm not a historian, I'm an activist, spend most of my time around issues in policing. But I have this idea that historians are always like discovering these new things that you didn't know existed, that you're like, wow, I thought this, and then you find this thing, you're like, whoa, even crazier. What were some of those things in the book, or in the process of writing this book? Were there things that you were like, okay, I thought this, and then you learned something that was just completely different than what you thought you might find?
So I think it wasn't as much something that I found in sort of researching. I think, I would say the chapter on color, one of the chapters is on color or colorism, and I sort of talk about the way in which light people, or light-skinned black people, let's say, and I talk about the ways in which people view them as superior, and there are a series of racist policies that give them greater access and greater resources and opportunities than darker-skinned people of color. So I actually distinguish between what I call light people and dark people. And so I went in search of disparities, and the disparities currently between light and dark people, I mean, it's just overwhelming. And of course, I described and cited many of those, whether those disparities are local to the United States or even across the world. But I think most of what sort of shocked me was really looking into my own personal story. Whether it was that I found out in the course of researching for this book that my great-great-grandfather was white, which was somewhat of a family secret, because some parts of the family were saying that, that woman was Native American.
Right.
But then, the more research I did, the more I realized that this woman was biracial. My great-great-grandmother, or my great-grandmother. Sorry. That was, of course, very revealing. But then also in terms of, I would say, the chapters on gender and sexuality. I knew, for instance, I talk about these two women who I went to graduate school with, Kyla and Yaba, who Kyla was this sort of queer, very outspoken black woman, and Yaba was bisexual, queer black women. They were both feminists. They were both very critical of black male homophobic patriarchs, and they created a discourse and an environment in my graduate program in which if you were sexist, if you were homophobic, and most of the people there were champions of black people, but they weren't necessarily champions of black women or black queer or black queer women, they were just not having it. And they, in a way, sort of, because I was afraid of them, right? I knew in many levels how much of an impact they had on me sort of challenging my own ideas particularly about black queer people and about black women. But I didn't really know the extent of it until I really started to reflect on it, until I really interviewed them, until I really interviewed other people, until I started to really recreate that story. And there's no way that anyone can be an anti-racist if they do not view all black racial groups, let alone other races, as basically equal. If they view certain racial groups as superior or more hypersexual or anything, that's a problem. That's a racist idea. And so I think they were critical in that development in ways I didn't realize until writing this book.
In that chapter, you write, whenever Kai and Yaba were seated there, whenever they were anywhere, their presence was unmistakable, memorable, and unsettling and inspiring. I could go to war with them at my side. I learned from them that I'm not a defender of black people if I'm not sharply defending black women, if I'm not sharply defending queer blacks. I read that because there are a lot of people, especially at home, who sort of participate in this logic that says, like the gay agenda, right? This idea that there are issues about race and then there are issues about sexuality, and that fighting about sexuality actually distracts us from this conversation about race. What do you say to those people?
I mean, I would say that you have black people who are being subjected to ideas, whether homophobic ideas, if you're talking about queer people in general, or what in the book I call queer racist ideas, which are specifically ideas targeting black gays or black lesbians. And then those very same people are subjected to policies as a result of both their race and their sexual orientation, but more specifically that intersection. And so to deny that existence, to deny the existence of queer racism, is to deny a form of racism, is to deny the way in which racism exists in that way. And so in many ways, depending on the type of form, I would either call them a hypocrite, because I would say, you say when these other people say racism doesn't exist, you get upset at that, you challenge that, but you're simultaneously saying racism doesn't exist, particularly queer racism doesn't exist. Explain to me that contradiction. And I would say that every black person, just like every other person in any other race, is not just racialized. They also typically have a sexual orientation, they have a gender, they have a nationality, they have an ethnicity, and racism doesn't just function in this straight way that affects them based on their race. It is typically intersecting in some critical way with all of these other forms of bigotry. And that's why, to truly be anti-racist, you truly have to oppose every form of bigotry in the world.
Boom. There we go. One of the things that you sort of recall to your first book in the failure chapter is a conversation about abolitionists, sort of the other side of the abolitionists. This idea, there's a notion that the abolitionists wanted to free slaves, and they were wholly sort of noble about that mission. And you sort of disrupt this idea of nobility by talking about the paternalism and other things. How do you help people sort of reckon with this seemingly good group of white people who fought for the end of slavery, but still harbored these ideas that in some ways were like rooted in a racist ideology?
I mean, one of the ways I tried to sort of do that is really compare that to the way in which that's functioning today. And so one of the most popular racist ideas that is very predominant among people, particularly white people who I would consider either progressive or even radical, is this idea I talk about in the book called the oppression inferiority thesis, which essentially argues that oppressive conditions, in that time slavery, it wasn't just dehumanizing, the argument goes. It literally made black people into subhumans. And so that's why abolitionists, like most notably William Lloyd Garrison, who was probably the most prominent white male abolitionist in the United States, who of course came over here several times to speak, and he would talk about black people enslaved black people as being brutes, as being imbruted. And why did he make that case? Because slavery was so horrific, slavery was so dehumanizing, it literally made these people into brutes. Now, it sounds great from the standpoint of propaganda. In other words, oh my God, it's so bad that it's making these humans into basically virtual animals. But the flip side of that is you're saying what? These people are brutes. So that when abolition comes, abolitionists, are not going to say all these people need are rights and resources. No, they actually need to be civilized back into humans, which is precisely what William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists said. We can't give these people 40 acres and a mule, they'll just ruin it. And you know what the black folks said in response to that? Who do you think did all the work? Right? And so this idea that oppression literally is making black people inferior, the oppression then was slavery. The oppression now is primarily poverty. And so people think that poor people or people growing up in impoverished neighborhoods, that the poverty is making them inferior, not making them sicker, which is a different conversation, not draining them of resources and opportunities, is a different conversation. It's literally making their culture and behavior inferior. And so many white people believe that and believe that it's a progressive idea without realizing that it is reinforcing racial hierarchy and then leading them to be paternalistic. Because obviously if you believe that these people need more than resources, if you believe these people need more than different policies, you're gonna what? Out of care, be them for them. Oh, let me help you, let me develop you. There's supposedly something called developing nations. Let me give you aid to develop you. No, all these people need is resources and opportunities. And I think that's what white people, particularly white people who are striving to be anti-racist, should be seeking to do.
Boom. I had never thought about this idea of like civilized back into humanity. You're right. That is so much of what Trump is doing with immigration, is that this idea with like the kids and stuff is that like they are inferior people, and that part of the immigration project is to actually like make them into worthy people. You know, one of the things too that I want to talk about is like the context within which both of the books sort of arose. The first book was sort of at the heels of the protests had just ended at home, and this book is out, going to be out in the heels of a whole nother set of protests around the guy in the White House. How has we try? You know, so hard, y'all, so hard. How has the political context within which you wrote informed the way you thought about sort of freedom or liberation or struggle?
Well, I think first and foremost, I don't think I would have even had the confidence that this book would be received well if not for the movement that you helped build, if not for the movement for Black Lives Matter, if not for the anti-racist movement that has been spanning the globe. Now, obviously, that movement wasn't enough to keep Trump, out of the White House, but that—
The Russians helped him, just to be clear.
Precisely,
It wasn't
yes.
us.
But this is a movement that exists. And as a result, you have so many people, and I think this was even before Trump, right? You had both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton talking about institutional racism on the campaign trail, which was the first time two major candidates were talking about racism and in that type of way. And so I think that there was an appetite. People had reflected and recognized just how searing and pervasive racism truly was because of, I think, the movements for liberation. And then finally, I think activists, and this is what I try to encourage other scholars to recognize, activists always sort of cause me to basically have more hope. I mean, they do the impossible. I mean, what y'all did, you're able to sort of achieve the impossible. And so if people on the ground, if activists on the ground can achieve the impossible, why can't we as scholars achieve the impossible from a literary standpoint, from a scholarly standpoint? Why can't we break new ground? Why can't we compel people to think differently about themselves? Some people thought, when we were really early on talking about this book, that no, it's going to be impossible for people to reflect on themselves. Like, they're so defensive about race that this would just be a lost cause. Maybe you should try to sort of just continue to write these narrative histories and not be so direct in asking people to look in the mirror for the first time in their lives. But I feel like America is ready. I feel like the world is ready because of what activists have done.
Boom. I agree. Now, we're going to get some questions from the audience, but before we do that, in the failure chapter, you sort of go back to this notion of the importance of defining terms. So you define the difference between demonstration and protest. So much of your work is about the act of definition in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why defining the terms is a key part of this work if we're ever to build an anti-racist society?
I think, obviously, when you have so many people, when you have someone like Donald Trump saying they're not racist, and not only that he's not racist, that he's the least racist person in the world.
Quote.
Yeah, so when you have that, what that fundamentally, and then you have people like me saying, no, you're actually the least anti-racist person in the world, right? I guess that wasn't as funny. And
they haven't bought the book yet.
Exactly.
That's what it is.
The only way in which he can make that case, the only way in which people across the world can make that case is if we are truly debating definitions, right? And I think so many people self-identify as not racist, not only because they're defensive, but because they really, truly do not know a very clear and concise definition of a racist, or even an anti-racist, or even, and so many people think that every single time people put up any single time people engage in activism, it is a protest, right? Because they don't have a clear definition of what is a demonstration versus what is a protest. They don't have a clear definition of what is mobilizing versus what is organizing. And I think having those types of definitions can allow people to understand their racial reality. I mean, a lot of my work, very simply, is seeking to provide people with a vocabulary for understanding their racial world for themselves. I mean, that's if people can just take my work and say, okay, now I understand this, now I understand that, this is the term I should use for this and that, I think that will be so useful for people because obviously, as you know, racism is deeply complex, but at the same time, there are ways in which we can clarify it. And I just wanted for people to have simple definitions. That's why almost every chapter is prefaced with a definition. so that we can really define our racial world.
And what do you find that, you know, imagine you spend so much time talking about racism and anti-racism, and there are a lot of well-meaning white people who are sort of like, I get it, I'm ready, and then start to do some work and struggle. Like, what do you find to be the thing that people trying to be anti-racist, that they struggle with? Like, what are the things that you've seen that are common that people, like, become these roadblocks? And I know you talked about denial, but is it sort of around uncovering their own? I don't know, like, what's the what there that people struggle with?
It seems to me, and I think other people can probably, well, let me just say, I think it seems to me both that the definition that people hold for a racist, that it's a bad person, and the definition that people hold for themselves, that they're a good person. And so I think once they get rid of that definition, that racist is a, quote, bad person. I mean, abolitionists were racist. Civil rights activists were racist. Y'all face folks in the streets in Ferguson who were racist. I mean, this just because a person is doing good things doesn't necessarily mean that they are not thinking that on some level black people are the problem. Like, you know, the guy who was killed in Baton Rouge, forgetting Alton Sterling, the person, I'm sure you saw this, the person who caught that on footage is a massive black on black crime activist, right? Thinking that part of the main problem is black on black crime, right? But he did a great thing, right, in capturing what happened to Alton. And so I think that's hugely difficult for people but once they release that, once they release this sort of connection between bad person and racist, once they recognize it's actually what I'm doing and saying in the moment, and so from this day forward, I'm going to do and say anti-racist things. But then also I think the other issue, as you know, is the connections that people have. And so one of the reasons why people struggle in the United States is because typically if they're racist, their partner's racist, their friends are racist, their families are racist, everybody around them is racist, and one of the social bonds that they have is saying that there's this Latinx invasion or that migrants are ruining England, right? And so these are the ideas that they share with people. So them moving to be anti-racist, in a way, causes them to move away from people they hold dear, which is absolutely and obviously very difficult for people to do. Which I don't really know how to answer that, and to really deal with that.
I did want to ask because I could see somebody hearing what you just said and then sort of say this idea: can people of color be racist?
So I would say yes, and I would say that. Well, first and foremost, as I talk about early in the book, when it comes to black people, I view internalized racism as the real black on black crime. And I've been trying to push back away from this idea that black people don't have power. Because the irony is that when you say black people don't have power, you are not recognizing people like Clarence Thomas, who has had the power, who's a Supreme Court justice in the United States, who literally has the power to flip the court. You're not recognizing people like Ken Blackwell, who was the Secretary of State in Ohio when that state went to Bush, primarily because of his voter suppression machinations. But most importantly, you're not recognizing that every individual has the power to resist. And there are some people, some black people, who do not resist because they think black people are the problem. So they literally are, in fact, not using their power because of their racist ideas. Like, why are you going after these cops? And I mention a story in the book, in the black chapter, that talks about this, in which I was having this discussion with this black editor of a newspaper that I was writing for when I was a senior in college. I had written a piece that was very critical of white people. He, of course, had serious problems with it, not only because of his own ideology, but also because some of his white writers had written into his newspaper saying, how could you have this person on staff? And so he challenged many of the ideas that I had, and then eventually he flipped the script, sat there for a second, didn't say anything, and ultimately said, this is a black guy. I hate it. I have a nice car, and I'm quoting him, but I hate it when I get pulled over and I'm treated like I'm one of them niggers. What he was saying ultimately is, I am not one of those N-words. He was distinguishing himself. He was creating this racial group, the N-word, and distinguishing himself from them, and then simultaneously saying, I shouldn't, because who I am, because I'm an extraordinary Negro, I shouldn't be subjected to police harassment. And simultaneously, he was saying to the cop, you know what, you're not the problem, they're the problem. And so obviously, when you would obviously come and, let's say, organize in his community, he would resist you and say, oh, why are you trying to organize against the cops here, DeRay? They're not the problem, black people are the problem. And so I think that, obviously I'm a little passionate about this, because as you know, DeRay, there are people we can't organize in our community. And we can't organize them, or we're struggling to organize them, because they view themselves as the problem. And that is a racist idea. They can't even see the way in which racism exists. Every time they falter in their lives, every time they look at racial disparities, they see what's wrong with black people. And the irony is they believe this because they have consumed wholesale racist ideas primarily produced by white Americans. And so, for me, I'm hoping that How to Be an Anti-Racist is read by everyone, including black people, because I think we too imagine that we're not racist or we can't be racist. And we too should be striving to be anti-racist.
There we go. Thank you. I think we have time for a question. They're going to kill me. I think there's a mic around here. Somebody said there's a mic. Okay, we'll go right here. Pink shawl. I think that's a shawl. Is it a shawl?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hiya, thank you very much. I recently heard a trans BIPOC activist describe race as, like gender, as being a societal construct. And I just wondered how you felt about that, and is that something that can be part of our anti-racist work now, or have we just got too much else to do before we can get to that kind of point?
So actually, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I identify... Just DeRay need to roll on the road to me. I identify race as a power construct. And so when you look at the history of the construct of race, it has been produced by some of the most powerful people in the world for a very specific reason. And so I think we should actually understand it as more of a power construct of blended difference. In other words, the blending of all of these nationalities and ethnicities and cultures and classes and genders into one people. That's, to me, how we should understand it.
Stripes. Clear. I don't know what I'm a little jet lagged, so sorry. Shawl, stripes, here we go.
I'll accept stripes. As a son of the American South who found a home in Scotland 12 years ago, I'm deeply grateful to you for writing this book. My question is about the polarization in both my home country and my adopted land of Scotland. I wonder if you see evidence of collaboration, which I think is the link between truth and reconciliation, collaboration between Muslims, Jews, LGBT, Hispanics, people of color, because I believe that source of collaboration, to use the metaphor of the marquee that we're in, is the sparks that may result in how to be an anti-racist.
So I think one probably good thing is probably not the best way to describe it. One good effect of Trumpism is Trump has targeted those four groups. And as a result, Trump activists and politicals are now trying to retrench against their anti-Semitism. But obviously, their voters are, have expressed anti-Semitic views and have shot up houses of worship. And so what's actually happening on some level is, people are recognizing the ways in which white nationalists, whether white nationalists are holding guns or white nationalists in the White House, are fundamentally targeting those four groups. I don't know, and so as a result, it's bringing them together on some level. But at the same time, there are deep bigotries still separating those groups. And there are ways in which those groups still imagine that their cause is the cause. And it prevents them, I think, from, I don't know what DeRay thinks about.
Oh, no, I was talking to her. No, keep going.
Sure.
I was talking to the mic. Do you know what's wild about the South is that half the black people in the United States actually live in the South, like today, which is really wild given that there are almost no elected leaders at any state position in the South. At Mississippi, just got a couple people in Mississippi at the local level, but not at the state level. I think we have time for one more question. I was whispering to her about that and whatever. I will do yellow shirt over here.
Thank you so much to both of you for talking. I wonder if I could ask about your thoughts on the role of music in building an anti-fascist society. Certainly in the UK we have probably more than ever lots and lots of young white people listening to music made by young black people, often from very economically marginalised groups, maybe without much insight into where that music comes from. And I wondered if you could, what your thoughts are on, I'm thinking specifically of grime, I guess, as a form of music. I wonder what your thoughts are on how that could be harnessed for a good in society, for building an anti-racist society while dealing with all the problems around cultural appropriation and other things.
Sure. So I think obviously musicians, popular musicians, have the platform to spread anti-racist ideas through their music. But what they also have the ability to do is produce art that activists, particularly engaged in very difficult and emotionally draining and long-standing 400 days of activism, can use to rebuild themselves, to charge themselves, right, on a daily basis. Music sometimes gives you courage, right, that you wouldn't ordinarily have, if you didn't put pop in that song. I mean,
Beyonce.
we talk about. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we people most notably understand like civil rights movement in which you would have, I'm thinking of the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, and which lasted almost a year, and almost each day those primarily black women domestics who were primarily the ones who were not taking the buses would crowd into the church or the churches and listen to gospel songs that would energize them, that would give them the ability to go on the next day and protest. And so I think both spreading anti-racist ideas, and giving people the courage to yet again step out there and protest power.
So everybody, Ibram is not doing a signing right after because he is taking a plane right back to go home, but he has already signed the books before. So if you go to the bookstore, you'll find signed copies of his book. Let's give him a hand. Thank you so much, Ibram. Thank you, everybody.
I looked through the catalogue, and it was one of the ones that sort of stuck out to me, particularly, the way he was going to be interviewed by an important person from the United States. And they were mentally very stimulating, and it was great to listen to them and to hear the questions afterwards.